People have their dogs. Hello.
Right, exactly. Hello.
I love it when a cat walks by or someone's dog
Right.
barks and like, I'm sorry. I'm like, no, I love it. It's the best. My kid being loud out there. I was literally doing an interview. My kid was like pounding on the door, and I'm like, just ignore it. It's fine.
Yeah.
All right, what are you gonna do?
I would say let's go ahead and get started.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for being here for what is our noontime and Rabbi Bromberg's nighttime for our From Narrowness to Freedom, letting go of weight, stigma, and embracing a fuller life. I think this is the first or one of our first Passover programs that we're doing, because our whole theme of Pesach this year, we decided that it was going to have a theme, is going to be leaving Egypt, because there's so many Egypts. Obviously for the Seder's, we celebrate leaving Egypt as told in the Torah, but there are so many Egypts. So yes, we might have left that Egypt. But what are the other Egypts we're still dealing with? Like we've talked about the Egypts, and we're dealing with the Egypt of homelessness, and about the Egypt of systemic racism, and what about the Egypt of weight stigma? And that's when I thought, I just have someone who I know, and I remember from several years ago, who would be perfect with that, and that would be Rabbi Minna Bromberg. So for those of you who are not familiar with Rabbi Bromberg, she is the founder and president of Fat Torah. Rabbi Minna Bromberg, PhD, so congratulations on that, is passionate about bringing 3 decades of experience in fat activism to her writing, her teaching, and change making at the nexus of Judaism and body liberation, bringing those two together, which I love. You have a book coming out, so that's really exciting. Belonging for Every Body, a Fat Torah guide to building inclusive spiritual community, and I cannot wait to see how that looks. She received her doctorate in sociology from Northwestern University with a dissertation in identity formation in interfaith couples, and was ordained at Hebrew College in 2010. Since then, you have led a conservative shul in Pennsylvania. You released a 5th album of original music. Something we haven't even talked about yet is that you were that's the first thing I knew about you, is that you were the Hebrew College person, and you were the person to go to if you needed help with tefillah skills. Everyone would go to Rabbi Bromberg, because she will know how to make you into good at what you're supposed to be doing as a rabbi. And that's when I met you, when you were running the Year in Israel program for Hebrew College, kind of based out of the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem, which is where I was studying at the time. That's where I met you. That's really cool. In addition to your work with Fat Torah, you are a voice teacher, and I hope everyone got that really loud and clear from all the messaging going on here, which is so, seriously, you have no idea, everyone. Like, find the recordings online. Not just that you are a great at using your singer as such a like prayer leader and singer, but also they're good at helping other people find their voices in prayer, which is its own kind of skill. And like I've mentioned, Rabbi Bromberg is coming to us live from Jerusalem, Israel, where she lives with her husband, Rabbi Dr. Alan Abrams, and their 2 wonderful children. I see their photos on Facebook, and they're beautiful.
You're welcome to look at my children.
I love looking at
your likewise. It is really delightful to be with you all here. I do have one brief apology to make, which is that we seem to be having sort of a dust storm, sandstorm thing that, it's not uncommon for this part of the world. Last night I found out that it had in fact also caused the Suez Canal to close. But right now it's impacting my own voice and my passages. So if I sound a little funny or need a little throat clearing break, please, I apologize in advance for that. But in any case, I'm going to start with a little song of moving from narrowness to freedom, just as a way of welcoming us to this particular space together. So this is lines from the one of the Psalms of Hallel that we'll sing during our Seder and during Pesach. Min hametzar karatiya, anani b'merchavya. From out of narrowness I called out to Yah, and Yah answered me with wide openness. Min hametzar karatiya, anani b'merchavya. Min hametzar karatiya, anani במרחביה. Anani, 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 במרחביה. Anani, במרחביה. So I want to start actually in a very different part of the Jewish calendar from Pesach with a story that I wanted to share with you about Sukkot. So I was invited to the sukkah of a local rabbi in a town that I was living in. And, everyone crowds into the sukkah, and the rabbi who was hosting us sat down on her little plastic chair, and two of the legs of the chair sort of ended up off of the edge of the little patio. And she was quite a small woman, but now all of her weight was resting on these two legs of this plastic chair, and the chair broke. So thank God everything was fine. She was able to hop up, and someone brought another chair, and it wasn't such a big deal. And she took her seat again, and she looked around, and she said, "Well, who knew that these chairs were so flimsy?" And I felt like it was one of those scenes in a movie where like one person raises their hand and then realizes that everyone else is on a different wavelength. So I'm like looking around the sukkah, and everyone's like, "Yeah, who knew that these chairs were so flimsy?" And I sort of felt like, okay, I guess I'll just lower my hand then, because in fact, the answer to the question, who knew these chairs were so flimsy, is every fat person ever took one look at these chairs and thought, wow, these chairs are really flimsy. How's this going to work? And is this going to work? And so I'm telling this story for a couple of different reasons. One is just to give you a sense that it's true that the experiences of fat people and the experiences of people who are not fat can be quite different. So that's just one piece of it, right? That they genuinely, in a very innocent way, it didn't occur to them that these chairs might not be accommodating for everyone who they were inviting to their sukkah. But also that it's not, I didn't say anything, right? It's not actually something, the needs of larger people are not actually something that we talk about in any kind of neutral or accommodating way in most spaces in our lives in general, and certainly that goes for our Jewish communal and family lives as well. And the other thing that I want to highlight that was amazing to me about what she said was that, we covered sort of the who knew part, right? But the other thing that she said was that these chairs are flimsy. And I was so struck by her saying just those few words, because I realized that when a larger person breaks a piece of furniture, our first reaction is not, wow, what a flimsy piece of furniture. It would have been good if whoever was hosting me had provided a piece of furniture that could actually accommodate me. No, but the first reaction of most fat people I know, even folks who've been involved in accepting their own bodies for years and years and years, is to feel really guilty and quite ashamed about the fact that we broke a piece of furniture. When, if you think about other kinds of diversity of bodies, right, I feel like we've come to a place, thank God, in our culture where we have a sense of wanting to be welcoming to diversity of most bodies. And yet somehow most of us have still really gotten caught up on what it might mean to actually be accepting of people in larger bodies, and what it might mean to actually think about how we might welcome one another in whatever body size we have. So that's just to give you a little sense of kind of the experience of coming into a Jewish communal space. And again, I'm someone who's a rabbi. I'm often invited into a lot of spaces. I'm not someone who's shy about being in Jewish communal space, but you can imagine, right, that that even I, who has quite a bit of comfort and privilege in most Jewish spaces, often feel unwelcome just because of even something like the physical layout of the situation or the seating that's provided. And I think it's something that we actually can talk about. And so one piece of moving from narrowness to freedom around weight stigma is just to make it actually a topic of conversation, which you are all now doing, which I'm very glad for, because I don't think it's anything that we need to be quiet about. I'm also someone who often has strangers make comments about my body in public. And when I share these experiences with others, I'm often told, oh, that was so impolite, right? That was so rude. Why are people so rude? And I think it's important to note that I don't actually experience this as an issue of politeness or manners, right? For me, the larger issue is, well, why are we making those judgments about another person's body in the first place? Right? So the act of saying something to someone about their body flows from having those judgments about others in the first place. And so for me, it's less an issue of politeness or rudeness and more an issue of weight stigma, which I find to be really pervasive in most of the settings that I'm in, certainly. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about my own journey, but also my sense of how we as Jews and as people in the context of Jewish communities can work toward freeing ourselves from weight stigma. So I have always been someone in a larger body, and I'll start just by letting you know why I use the word fat. And that is because I think it's a perfectly useful, neutral descriptor of the kind of body that I have. And just as the word Jew, right, used to be something that was used really as a slur when we were in anti Semitic context, it's a word that we've come to claim for ourselves as simply a useful descriptor of who we are. And so, similarly, I and many other people in the fat acceptance and fat liberation movements are really working both in our own conversations and in working with others on just reclaiming the term fat as a relatively neutral descriptor of a particular size and shape of a person's body. And so you'll hear me use that term when I'm describing myself. So I was always I was a fat kid. And when I was 7 years old, I decided that I should diet. Mostly in my 7-year-old brain, I thought that I would have more friends if I were thinner. And so I started going on diets. And of course, for those of you who've been involved in dieting in your lives, you know that there's no such thing as a diet, right? There's such a thing as weight cycling, meaning that we gain weight, we go on a diet, we think that somehow the problem is with us or with the diet when we regain weight. And so then we typically go on a different diet, right? We think maybe if we try something else. And so most people who've been involved in trying to lose weight in their lives have actually been doing what's called weight cycling and going on multiple diets. And I'm not going to use I'm not going to throw too many numbers at you, but for those of you who are interested in statistics, I'm happy to, follow up with you. But it is important to know that really since the 1990s, it's been pretty clear from research that about 95 to 98% of all diets do not result in long-term weight loss over a 5 to 10 year period. In other words, most people who go on diets, in fact, regain any weight that they lost, and plenty of folks gain more weight than they initially lost. And I was a growing child, right? So when I would regain weight that I had lost, of course, I gained more weight, which was good because I was growing. And I dieted. I did a variety of different diets and programs and things that didn't call themselves diets, but really were, until I was 16 years old. And really, by the time I was 16 years old, and I really, and I have to say that whole time, I really was quite dissatisfied with my body and really felt that, if only I were thinner, that all kinds of things in my life would be better. And by the time I was 16 years old, I was really, I was done with that whole thing. And I connected with the fat acceptance movement, which has been around in an organized way in the US since 1969. And I became involved as a teenager in the 1990s and have really been involved in fat activism and body liberation work since then. But it's really only in the last year that I realized that I wanted to be working on this really as my rabbinate and sort of bringing it together with my work as a rabbi. I had written before that. I had written a few things under the heading of Fat Torah. I had written a few, bulletin columns and divrei Torah, but really it came into a fuller blossoming in the last year. And I'll tell you just one other story about one of the catalysts for that. And then I think pretty soon we're going to open things up for, I know that Rabbi Fort had some questions, and we'll also just open things up to your questions as well, because I definitely want to hear what you have to say. But first, a sip of tea. So a little over a year ago, during Hanukkah of 2019, I was attending my then 3-year-old daughter's Hanukkah party at her gan, at her preschool. And there I was in a room with 40 or 50 3 to 5-year-olds and their parents. And there was, singing and dancing, and there was a nice young man who was leading the singing and dancing with his guitar. And I'm someone who, at this point in my life, usually feels relatively comfortable being myself in public, and I actually consider that a form of activism, to be comfortable being myself in public. And excuse me. And so I was, trying to do some dancing, but I also happened to be 9 months pregnant. And I found myself feeling a little bit uncomfortable moving around. And my discomfort was somewhat heightened when my 3-year-old daughter said to me, "No, Ima, you have to jump." And I was like, oh, honey, I'm not jumping right now. But I started getting this dialogue in my head saying, oh, well, it's because I'm pregnant, and I hope everyone knows that I'm pregnant, and that's why I'm uncomfortable. As if we're just not allowed to just not need a reason to be comfortable or uncomfortable in our bodies at any given point in time, or want to dance or not want to dance at any given point in time. So for me, that little voice in my head of, I hope everyone knows I'm pregnant, was actually what I would call internalized fat phobia, right? It was weight stigma that I've internalized, where somehow I need to make an excuse for how comfortable or uncomfortable I am moving my body, because, I wouldn't be sort of allowed to just not want to move my body. And then, because I've been involved in this work for 30 years, this other voice comes up and says, "Oh, no, don't listen to that voice of internalized stigma. You can just be in your body however you want to be, and really, who's paying any attention to you? And no one here is thinking anything judgmental about you, and it's okay. You can just be yourself." That worked out pretty well, I have to say. I moved as best I could and as much as I was comfortable, and tried to explain to my daughter why I wouldn't be jumping that day. So then we took a little break to eat sufganiyot, to eat nice jelly donuts for Hanukkah. And after a little while, the young man who'd been leading the music said, "Well, all right, you can all come back to dancing now, unless you've gotten too fat from those sufganiyot." And I thought, oh, right. That's why I was worried about people being judgmental of fat bodies, because people are constantly judgmental of fat bodies. And then I thought, wow, this is really a problem, that this happens in Jewish community, especially around our traditional foods, right? What does it mean that we're letting this stigma around fatness come between us and our enjoyment of sufganiyot? It's also a problem that this is something that you would say in front of a room of 3 to 5-year-olds, when we know that one of the leading causes of eating disorders is dieting. Right? Dieting is predictive of developing eating disorders, and certainly kids as young as 3 and 4 and 5 are getting those messages about what's good or bad about having a particular kind of body. And it really got me thinking about, the way that weight stigma in that sense really is a barrier to full belonging in community, right? If I don't feel like I can come and be myself and be welcomed being myself, then that really does create quite a barrier. So I was having all of this thinking about the ways that weight stigma is a barrier to belonging. And at the same time, I had all of a sudden, this upwelling of like, does this guy not know that this holiday of Hanukkah, is a celebration of fat? Like, that is what this holiday is actually about. We are here to celebrate fat and the way that, in this case, fat is being used as a symbol of our survival. That's what we're here to do. And so, out of this sense, both of the way that weight stigma does create a barrier to actual belonging, and the sense of how our tradition can be interpreted and taught in ways that are more liberatory, the Fat Torah was born. So I'm going to pause there and drink a little bit more tea, and I'm happy to open things up to you, Rabbi Ford, and then to any questions that folks have. Can't hear you.
Okay, cool. I don't know if I'm visible right now, but oh gosh, there I am. Hi. So thank you. And I, again, appreciate you, not just because it's, nighttime for you there, but because you've got like Hamsin and whatever going on right now. It's just like a whole wind situation. I definitely remember that. So thank you for all of that. And what I'm hearing from you is about like weight stigma for sure. And kind of like what that is, both in your lived experience and kind of just what you know in a more kind of intellectual academic sense, like what this weight stigma is. And I've seen you talk about how it impacts, I feel like I've heard about, like it impacts women, I feel like, and it impacts children. Do you see how that could impact men? And will that look similar or different in your experience?
Yeah.
Or
So
experience as someone who's not a man, obviously.
Right. No, I think weight stigma impacts people of all genders. And at the same time, it's very much something that interacts with gender. So that absolutely women are more impacted. And I think we are absolutely more impacted sort of on two different levels. So one thing that you heard me sort of alluding to was, the way that larger people really have our life chances impacted by weight stigma. But I think that people of all sizes are impacted by the ways that we feel like we need to police our bodies. And that certainly impacts that sort of policing of bodies definitely happens to women more. But on the other end of the spectrum, among people who are actually in larger bodies, we also see weight stigma interacting with gender, particularly around, certainly around pay gaps. So, for example, in other words, the pay gap between fat men and their not fat counterparts is not as large as the pay gap between fat women and thin women. So it absolutely interacts with gender in that way. I also have to say, it interacts certainly with disability, right? So you heard when I was talking about, making this sort of, but I'm pregnant, it's okay, I'm pregnant, right? You can hear how all of our ideas about being able-bodied versus being disabled and how that all works absolutely interacts with weight stigma. And there's also been really important work being done recently around the way that weight stigma interacts with racism. And not just interacts, but there's a wonderful and difficult book called Fearing the Black Body by a sociologist named Sabrina Strings that came out within the last 3 or 4 years, I believe. And she really looks at historically how weight stigma in the US context comes out of racist ideas about bodies and sort of how bodies should be. But it also interacts with racism in the sense that Black people in larger bodies are more impacted, both like by race because of their size and by by racism because of their size and by weight stigma because of their race. So a tragic example of this, right, is when Eric Garner was killed, and there was a lot of blaming his size for his death as opposed to blaming the police officers who were choking him. And that was actually used in the trial of the police officers who were involved. This sort of defense around, well, but he was, he was unhealthy, and so that's why he died, which was based completely on his size.
Interesting. Wow. I want to keep encouraging people to keep putting questions in the chat, and I'll definitely I think we definitely have time to get through them. So if you have questions, just put them in the chat, and you can either address them to everybody or you can address them to me personally if you don't want to announce into the room. Both are good choices. You talked about the being free of weight stigma and how that kind of intersects Jewishly. What are some ways that in a practical way, how does freedom from weight stigma interact with our Jewish lives?
So I think the biggest way that certainly that it interacts with my Jewish life has to do with certainly my sense when I stopped dieting, that this was my personal Yitziat Mitzrayim, that this was my emergence from this place of narrowness that I had been in for so much of my childhood and adolescence. And I think the way that sort of plays out, right, is that now when I sit at a Seder table and we're meant to be reliving our experience of that movement from narrowness to freedom, that I feel that in my body, right, that I have a sense of of what that feels like to make that move from feeling like you have to be a particular way, you have to do everything in your power and spend all of this energy and time and money, right, to try and get yourself to fit into a particular narrow ideal of what society wants from you, and to then be released from that. So I think you asked about practical terms. I think that there are practical ways, certainly, that in Jewish communal life we can work on confronting weight stigma. And in my work, I divide those into 4 different areas of impact, meaning areas where we can see weight stigma showing up in Jewish communal life, and also where we can deploy Jewish tradition to confront those and to be more liberatory. So one of those is sacred space, which I addressed with the story of the Sukkah, right? That we can make our spaces more accommodating to larger people. Sacred speech has to do with how we talk about bodies. And I have to say that since I've been doing this work, I've heard from many, many people about the ways that clergy talk about their own bodies from the Bima. And sort of, like stories about rabbis sharing their weight loss journeys and things like that. And I think that, these were things that I wasn't really even privy to before, because of course, when I'm giving a sermon, that's not what I'm talking about. But what was so powerful to me about it is, that does real harm to people, right? That it's both stigmatizing to any larger people in the congregation, but that it also, when we're looking around at our community, this is not just true for clergy, right? This is true for any of us. When we're looking around at our community, we can identify the people who are larger, but we can't identify all the people in smaller bodies who might have a very disordered relationship to their body and to eating. And it's often quite triggering to people who are in recovery from eating disorders or have not yet recovered from eating disorders to have people talking about their diets. So one piece of sacred speech is just refraining from that kind of talk in our communities. And then the others are sacred time and sacred text that have to do with how we relate to our holidays. So thinking about things like traditional foods and not, letting diet culture kind of invade our sense of what we're allowed to eat, especially when it comes to our traditional foods. And then the last one, sacred text, is just about, using our texts, using the text of our Siddur and the text of our Torah to find ways to, and certainly the text of our Talmud to find ways to reinforce the idea that all humans are created in God's image, and that includes people of a wide range of sizes.
Amen. I think that's beautiful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We've had some interesting questions come in. I would love to kind of bounce in your direction.
Yeah.
One person asks, how do you handle the medical community that emphasizes weight in relationship to diseases like diabetes, heart issues, etc.?
Well, so personally, what I try to do, and this is true, this, connects with other fat activists as well. One thing to do is to really ask our doctors to be evidence-based, right? To actually, when they're treating a patient, to actually look at the patient's records and lab tests the same way they would for a thin patient. There are certainly some diseases that are correlated with size, but there aren't any diseases that fat people have that thin people don't. And so one way that people are often advised to talk to their doctors is to say, well, how would you treat a thin person with the same condition, right? Because prescribing weight loss, when we know in an evidence-based way that it doesn't work more than 5% of the time, is really not good medical practice. And I agree that this is, pervasive in medical settings. So hopefully, and there are actually also people who are working on sort of the medical education side of things and really trying to work with doctors and nurses in their education around being more evidence-based about treating people in larger bodies, because we just we don't have good evidence that prescribing weight loss is overall a healthy thing to do.
You can't argue with science. I can see the trying. That I've had a few interesting ones come in. Not when talking to medical professionals, but if when someone who is like a friend or a loved one is saying, I'm saying this out of concern for your health. I'm worried about your weight because I'm concerned for your health, and this comes on because I love you. Mm-hmm. How to handle that? That was another one that came.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great way to. I think linking into our Jewish values here is actually really wonderful, because I think we can think about, okay, well, if you truly believe that someone in a larger body is necessarily diseased, what do our Jewish values teach us? Sorry, there's an insect.
There was one here, so I think it flew over there.
Exactly, we're so connected. How do what does our Jewish tradition teach us about how to be with people who are sick? Because I think it generally doesn't teach us that we should offer unsolicited advice, for example, just as one example. So there's a wonderful one of the favorite healing stories in the Talmud is about when Rabbi Yochanan goes to visit various people who are sick, and he the first thing he does is say, "Are your sufferings welcome to you?" And when they say no, then he puts out his hand and raises them up and heals them, essentially. And the end of the story is even better, but we're not going to talk about that right now, because really what's so amazing to me about reading this in terms of how we work with people who are ill is that really first, whether it's someone you know and love or not, the first question is really, is my help welcome to you, right? Is the help that I can offer something that's actually going to be helpful to you? Because I think that it's inescapable. So this happens often in doctors' offices as well, that you'll sort of get asked, well, have you thought about losing weight? Like, I live in a body that the entire society thinks should lose weight. Like, this isn't something new to me. And so you can sort of rest assured that yes, this person has thought about losing weight, and B, that really it's worth first trying to assess whether whatever help it is that you think you have to offer will actually be welcome and helpful.
Thank you for addressing that. It's a good question. Someone says or asked, just talking about how kind of riffing off what you were saying about how the whole dieting just doesn't work, and it just doesn't work. So can you talk a little bit and how kind of medical science and has just failed in regards to kind of weight control was the term used. And so could you talk a little bit about obesity being involuntary?
Yeah, I mean, if it weren't involuntary, given the fat phobic society that we live in, I can guarantee you that the vast majority of fat people would not be fat anymore. So I think, you know, the whole idea of, and this is absolutely, you know, you're right, this is absolutely a common notion that that being larger is a lifestyle choice. And in fact, I had someone here in Israel, they, you know, we've, thank God, you know, we've been able to do a good job with vaccinating people. Um, I was able to get my vaccine a little bit earlier. Now everyone 16 and up is getting their vaccines or has already gotten, but I was able to get mine a little bit earlier because of my size. And I literally had someone who I did not know on a Facebook group tell me that it wasn't fair that I got my vaccine before a thin person did, since my size was a lifestyle choice. Right? So there you very clearly see the way that the problem with framing size as a lifestyle choice is that it essentially values the lives of thinner people over the lives of larger people. Um, so yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Someone asked, what do you think of when rabbis talk about exercising or taking care of your body? Specifically, they asked, do you think that is sizist or ableist?
I think there are absolutely ways to talk about taking care of our bodies, and particularly around exercising, that are weight neutral. And you know, the good news about medical and health science is that we have really actually decent ways of measuring people's health that have nothing to do with their weight. And so, so I think that yes, absolutely, there are ways to talk about exercising and other health practices in ways that are weight neutral. There's a I mentioned that the fat acceptance movement had been around since 1969. Since the 90s, there's also been a movement called Health at Every Size that really looks at sort of weight neutral approaches to health and health research. So if you're curious about that, you can Google Health at Every Size. Um, and so there are ways to do that. I've rarely seen it done. I would say it's rare in our. I'm happy to like train people how to talk about exercise without bringing in weight stigma. I think it's something that people can learn how to do, but that it's relatively rare. And I guess the other thing I would say is that, you know, another ism that weight stigma really intersects with quite a bit is healthism. In other words, this sense that our health is entirely something that we can control, when again, that, you know, we know from the research that much of our health is determined by where we're at socially, right? Social determinants of health play a much, just statistically, much larger role in our health outcomes than our own health practices, which is not, you know, like if there's something that you're doing because you believe it's better for your health, or if you have a particular condition that you've been advised by a doctor, it can be impacted by, you know, how you eat or how you move your body. That's one thing. But in general, this sort of elevating of health practices that don't have a particular basis in evidence over so many other aspects of our lives, it's quite problematic from my perspective, and certainly interacts with weight stigma.
I think second to last question is so far that you kind of start seeing in the Torah this discussion of like what like women and their bodies, specifically in talking about women, is like the Sarah. So it's, you know, I guess the part where, you know, Aram looks over and saying, oh, suddenly you're like, wow, my wife is really beautiful. I never saw it before. And so the question is kind of like, how do you see, I think I'm interpreting this right, how do you see kind of how maybe the Torah or maybe just Jewish tradition and culture, if it is a thing, it's a very big amorphous thing, kind of affects us and our encounter of kind of weight stigma?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, obviously different cultures have very different ideas of what is beautiful. And the idea that that fat women are not beautiful is a relatively recent idea in human history. Um, so, um, so I think that, absolutely there are cultural standards of beauty that vary from, from one place and time to another. I don't actually. Um, I hear you that the Bible mentions Sarah's beauty, but I don't actually see Torah as especially sort of looks focused. Um, and I would also say that um, most of the associations with there are a couple of exceptions, but most of the associations with fat and fatness in Torah are just have to do with fat and plenty, right? That sense of fat as being symbolic of abundance. So there's this one king, this one fat king in the Book of Judges, who is made fun of and also killed. But he doesn't really come up in Jewish liturgical readings, so most people don't really know very much about it.
Well, I like it. I like it. It's maybe it's a return to the way we should be thinking about things, which is not in terms of weight.
Right. I mean, I think right. I mean, I think that again, especially, the more I learn about the way that weight stigma connects with racism in certainly in North American culture, it's clear to me that there's sort of more going on here than just, being concerned about people's health.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, for me, and in terms of the work of Fat Torah, that, it's another way that we can think about being anti-racist is to work on also being more body liberatory in all kinds of ways. Yeah, and I'm happy to talk about any other aspect of this work as you like.
Well, I mean, I had a question, but then there's another one that came up that's even better than the question I had to wrap us. What are some tangible ways that we can, kind of keep having this kind of conversation? Because I think, like, as you said, and the reason that we wanted, that I was like, I need to bring Rabbi Bromberg is because this conversation seems so important, and it doesn't seem like it's happening so much, and it's to literally everyone's benefit. What are some tangible ways, somebody asked, to keep this kind of conversation, to keep this conversation? How do we support this conversation, keep that going in our community, especially because of how much diet culture has been, it's like pushing in and making unwelcome space for this kind of conversation.
Yeah. I mean, and I think we have to be like, honest about the fact that the diet industry is a $72 billion industry just in the US, right? So there are genuinely powerful forces pushing diet culture on us. So I think that's important to note, that it's not sort of just another opinion floating around there, right? It's actually this industry that's backed by quite a bit of economic oomph. So I think in terms of how to keep the conversation going, I think that, my book isn't out yet, but certainly there are wonderful books out there. I mentioned Health at Every Size. The person who wrote Health at Every Size, Lindo Bacon, came out with a book recently called Radical Belonging. It's quite good. There are also Dr. Joy Cox just wrote a book called Fat Girls and Black Bodies, which looks at, these issues, but with that intersectional lens of looking at weight and race. There's a lot of good work. You could certainly have a body liberation book club, and I'm happy to provide a list of books for that. You can also Fat Torah has a Facebook group that's a lovely community. If you look for Fat Torah in groups, you're welcome to join us there. And people often have other ideas about what's working in their own communities. I think it's great to think about how to get some weight neutrality or body diversity or body acceptance on the curricula of our educational programs, especially because of that concern about the ways that eating disorders develop among really children who can be quite young. And eating disorders are actually one of the of all of our forms of mental illness. Eating disorders are actually one of the most deadly. They have a higher mortality rate than most other forms of mental illness, unfortunately. So I would say those are a few ways, and of course, you're welcome to also, sign up for Fat Torah's mailing list and follow us on social media, just to sort of have it more in your day to day life. I think, though, that it's also worth noting that these are not always easy conversations for people to have. And so if you're someone who wants to continue having these conversations in your community, I would encourage you to also make sure that you're part of some other community online, or mostly online, of folks who are supportive of this kind of conversation, because it's good to have your own support if you're going to be especially if you're going to be trying to talk one-on-one to the people in your communities about it. It's fruitful but challenging, I would say.
Yeah. Yes, like all worthwhile conversations,
Right.
fruitful and challenging at the same time, which is
I mean,
just
especially
true.
right. Especially, I think so many adults have dieted for so much of their life that
Hmm.
that invitation to be free of that can also cause a lot of defensiveness around regret at the amount of time and energy and money that they've put into this pursuit.
Sure.
And so even people who you would think would be sort of the most open to it, can often be quite resistant, because it's hard to imagine that you could have done something different with your life.
Yeah, there's a pain there for sure. I makes sense.
Yeah.
Someone asked, how can someone who is fat help themselves feel a better sense of belonging, like not feel inferior or like they don't belong in a social setting?
Yeah. So first, I want to say that in an ideal world, the burden wouldn't be on the person who's marginalized to um, make themselves feel less marginalized. I just want to say that, because I think that, especially as body positivity has become more of a thing in the last 15 years or so, there's some sense that it's on each of us to feel really great about our bodies, no matter how we're treated. And that's kind of an undue burden to put on yourself. That I would say. On the other hand, I think there are wonderful practices for loving our own bodies. And from my perspective, I was able to do that really through community and through connecting with other people who were kind of showing me the way. And so I would absolutely encourage anyone who wants to do that work to connect with others. There's a lot of fat phobia in social media, but there are also really wonderful ways of connecting with people that we really didn't have in the past. So again, you're welcome to find me, and I'm happy to introduce you to other folks and other groups. There's some really good resources out there these days, and some of the books that I mentioned as well that are really about loving ourselves. There's a wonderful book by a woman named Sonia Renee Taylor, "The Body Is Not an Apology," which is a really great starting place around radical self-love.
And maybe what we'll do, and Jennifer can tell me if this isn't possible or whatnot, but maybe what we can do is kind of get like your whatever the information you want to give out about like how to get in contact with Fat Torah and to see what you're doing there, which is so great, and then also whatever resources, just have that so we can send that out to everybody who's registered for this. That way we can just disseminate that. And I think Jennifer can follow up. Is that correct?
I can do that. Absolutely.
Awesome. And just speaking of resources, someone asked, just because like this is a kind of a different tack, same thing, not resources, but different kind of resources. What are resources like books, etc., to offer to children, especially couching in Jewish terms and values, because this person feels like their daughter comes home with some really distorted information about food and nutrition?
Yes, it's true. So I would say that I don't yet know of any books that have been written from a Jewish perspective, although it's definitely on our agenda of Fat Torah books to write. It's not the first book we're writing, but it's on there. But there are some good books out there for kids. Again, why don't let me get those to Jennifer, because I haven't. I'm less familiar with them, but I know there are some good books out there that tend to be focused on sort of on size diversity and the idea that people come in all sizes. But I think there are also some out there that are specifically about what I would call sort of an anti-diet approach to how we eat and how we feed ourselves, which is pretty important. Yeah.
We'll be really waiting on that list tweets it out to everybody, all the good resources.
Yeah.
Especially, I know I follow Fat Torah on Facebook, and I highly recommend it to everyone who's on Facebook. It's a great resource, just for
one name. One name that I would mention who does great work around kind of how to talk to our kids is a woman, a journalist named Virginia Sole Smith, SOLE-Smith. She has wonderful stuff on not so much for kids, but for parents of kids.
Great place to start.
Definitely.
I think that's it for our questions. And we've already talked about, I wanted to make sure we ended by saying like how could people find you, could find Fat Torah and the stuff that you're doing with it. And I think we covered it. So just another plug. Go on to Facebook and I think
Facebook, fattorah.com. You can find us on Instagram with a little dash between fat and Torah, an underscore between fat and Torah, because the name was already taken. Those are great ways to reach us. You can email me through the website if you have other questions. And yeah, I'm happy to be in touch. And we're probably going to do a big crowdfunding thing for the book soon. So I'll also get that out to you if you want to. It'll be a good way to pre-order copies and support the book actually getting done. So
looking forward, it's important. It has to be done. Yeah. Thank you so much for helping us start this conversation here. I feel very blessed that I got to meet you back when I was just a little rabbinical student, conservative yeshiva, and you were actually like an adult for real and like, a rabbi, but now you're just an adultier adult than you were then. And I feel so blessed to have known you then and to know you now and be able to bring your voice here and have your voice give voice to many, many other people and be a change maker, which is really exciting I'm sure for you personally and also for us in our community here. So thank you so much for coming here and staying up late. Appreciate it. Have a wonderful, wonderful Pesach.
Thank you. A really sweet Pesach to all of you. Good to be with you.
Thank you, everybody.
Keeping in touch. Take care. Bye.
Bye.